Okay, so I'm going to introduce After Effects, talk about sort of the basic interface, like stuff we've already sort of looked at, importing files, saving, exporting. And then I'm also going to talk about using masks in After Effects. And then May is going to talk about doing animations. So if you have After Effects open, you'll notice that it looks a lot like everything else we've been using. We have the projects panel over here, which is where you import all your files and where they all show up. We have the composition panel over here, which is where your movie is going to show up. We have layers down here and the timeline over here. And if you look at the menu for After Effects, you'll notice that it actually looks a little bit like the Photoshop menu. And you can actually kind of, compare them. I don't know what you were doing in this, but you'll notice that in Photoshop you have File, Edit, Image. In After Effects you have File, Edit, Composition, and they're very similar, composition being your sort of movie scene setup in After Effects, whereas in Photoshop you have an image file. And then you have layer, which is the same as Photoshop layers. You have effects, which are very similar to filters in Photoshop. So you'll notice similar things like blur and sharpen, working with color and changing the color balance of your image, and then different filters that you can put onto it. There's an animation menu. There's a view menu with your rulers and your guides, and your grid, and then the usual window and help. So to set up a file, and so basically think of After Effects as Photoshop for video. That's what it's primarily used for. So to open and set up a new file, we're going to go to Composition, and we're going to do a new composition. In this case, we're actually working with, if you've downloaded the files that were on Dropbox, in this case we're working with footage that's from a Canon DSLR. So we have HDTV 180 24, which means that it has a resolution of 1920 by 180, which is HD. It has square pixels and it has 24 frames per second. So that's kind of just what Terry had gone over earlier, finding the correct settings for your footage. So we're going to go OK, and I want you to follow along and make a new composition and then import a few files. So to import files, we can double-click on the Projects menu over here, and we can grab our files. So we can import image files, we can import Photoshop files, we can import movie files, or we can import the entire folder. So we're going to do that. For Photoshop files, when you're importing, it'll give you options of importing it as footage, as a composition, and as a composition retaining layer sizes. So we're going to use composition, and we're going to keep it at editable layer style so that it keeps all your layers as they are. So I've imported the Photoshop file that was in Dropbox, and what it does is it imports the file and it imports all of its layers. And we're also going to import our video file. So the first thing that we're going to look at is creating masks in After Effects, which are really useful. So we're going to drag our layers over to the timeline. I've noticed that when you import a Photoshop file, it does not keep the layers in the same order, but all your layers are there. So you'll kind of have to move them back in place. And so we're going to put masks on this. There are several ways that you can do masks. You can also do masks in Final Cut and Premiere, but you can get much more precise with them in After Effects. So does everyone know what masks are? Have you used them in Photoshop? Yes, no? What it does is it basically creates a transparent, it basically makes something show up and it hides everything else. So, in this file, I'm going to work with layer 1, which has my person on it, which is from the Photoshop file. And when you double click on the layer, it actually makes a new tab in the composition window specifically for your layer. So if I put a mask on this, you'll notice that this is the only part that shows up. So when you kind of go back to composition, where's the? So to draw a mask, you can use the icons up here. They're also very similar to Photoshop tools. So there's Select, Pen, and to draw a mask, we're going to use the rectangle tool or the pen tool. Do you know how I can get back to my to my whole composition? I thought it was over here. Okay. Okay, I'll just start. Oh, it's way over here. Yeah, I found it. So just need to get rid of that one. Okay. So to draw a mask, I want to click on the layer that I'm working on, and use either this tool, the rectangle tool, to show this part of the image. And you'll notice that in the actual composition, that's the only thing that shows up. Now this mask shows up sort of in a subfolder under the layer that I'm working on, which is just called layer 1 in this case. And you actually have options. You can, if you select Add, the box that I've drawn is what actually shows up. If I select Subtract, the box that I've drawn is hiding whatever's on that layer. I can draw more than one mask on a layer, so I can draw this, and then let's get a circle, and I can also draw another mask. And in this case, I have my rectangular mask set to subtract, which hides what's behind it. But I have my circular mask set to add, which shows what's inside the circle. I can also do masks with the pen tool beside it, which lets me select things much more precisely. So let's say that I'm working on the background layer and I want to cut out a window. I can use the pen tool to do that. And then if I go under the layer that I'm working on and look under masks, and set that to subtract, I will have my window masked out. So if I put another layer behind all of that, that will show up through the mask that I've cut out for it. So for instance, I can do a whole bunch of this. You can do the same thing in Photoshop for your still images. You can also right-click on your layers and work with, where is it? The blending mode, which some of you might know from Photoshop. And what that does is it changes the way that it's overlaid on the image below it. So you can set that to an overlay, or you can set that to hard light, for instance, and you'll get the image showing through it in different ways. So that's something that's kind of useful to play around with to get different results from your images that can look pretty nice. Going to So, yep.
Can you use a stopwatch for this? Like, would you make it blend into something like using a blend tool on this? Like,
Sorry, what do you mean?
Like 5 seconds in, could you make it blend, but transition it through?
Yeah, you can add keyframes to your mask, which is what I'm going to talk about next.
Yeah.
So, going back to this layer, for instance, say that I want to put a mask on this so that I get this part of the layer showing up, and then I get the entire person showing up 10 seconds later. The way I would do that is I would go under my mask sort of menu, or mask subfolder, go to mask path, and click on this little icon besides it, which is, I think, supposed to be a stopwatch. So once I click that, it makes a keyframe for me, and then I can move my slider to 5 seconds later and add another keyframe. And for my second keyframe, I want my mask to show this much of the person, let's say. So when I play this, it will actually do a transition between the first and second mass. Pretty slowly, I guess. Okay, maybe I set my keyframes too far apart. So I probably want that much faster. When you go back and play that, it should do a keyframe transition.